attempts to try and compile the guest lecture series for the International Human Rights Exchange, I looked for some degree of diversity in the speakers that we've had. You might have seen them rather dominated in the earlier part by graduates from the University of Witwatersrand. And then we did a slight deviation away from that when we had Yasmin Suka. And then I discovered that she also was a graduate of the University of Witwatersrand, having to flee the University of Durban-Westville in the days of its crisis. But absent from that program, I was able to ascertain that we didn't have enough linkage with the culture of human rights and the way in which the theory that you are learning in the classroom actually translates to the ordinary folk around the countryside. One of the ways in which we were able to transfer some kind of understanding of human rights is through the use of the media. And the newspaper and journalism would be a very important part of that. So when I did see Carmel about 2 months ago at a conference on the appointment of judges, I was highly delighted because I can recall listening to her some, should I say this, 20 years ago, in other activist speeches in Durban and in one or two venues in Pietermaritzburg. The reason I've chosen Carmel Rickard to speak to us, and her topic is the challenge of reporting on human rights, the same as reporting any other story. We find that human rights reporting can either be sensational, directed at the number of deaths and other horrors that are associated with the human rights violation, or they can be lacking in detail on certain kinds of court cases where we can see pictures of CNN and or other news reports simply following a white car or white vehicle of a suspected fugitive who ends up in a case in the US to become a kind of metaphor for justice. And here I refer to the O.J. Simpson case, which then leaves ordinary people quite confused about what human rights and whose human rights. Somebody who's aptly qualified to do all of this is Carmel Rickard, because she comes from a background of having left teaching in 1980 and joining the area of journalism and writing for local newspapers, and today now still writing a colorful column, the Blurb says, for The Weekender, and she has her own blog on the IOL blogs called Legal Matters. She has had a track record of reporting on some cases that have made legal history in South Africa. Accuracy in the reporting of those kinds of cases were fundamentally important. And as a result of that, I think you've been at least twice a winner, maybe more than that because they've been away from the country for a while, of the Legal Journalist of the Year awards. But she's rather modest about all these details. And it's a combination of that modesty and activism that makes Carmel a very attractive person to listen to. So Carmel, I think the floor is up to you.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know whether you heard the question that I'm supposed to talk about this evening. It's about whether the challenge of reporting human rights is different from the challenge of writing about anything else. And I think it's a fantastic question, and thank you very much for asking it. I'm grateful, very grateful that it's been asked, and I'm going to enjoy unraveling it with you. So I need to start off by explaining that I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a human rights lawyer. I'm a journalist, and I'm speaking from that perspective. And there's a lot of legal stuff that I don't know, and if we have a problem when it comes later in this evening, we might have to ask you for some help. But the point is, if you're going to do this job, you've got to get yourself a lot of lawyers who are willing to help you, so that if you get stuck, you can ask for help. That's a very important resource for journalists doing this kind of work. So, to the question, I'm afraid I have to answer it by saying yes and no. But one of the answers is a lot longer than the other. The shorter answer is the one that says, yes, it's the same. The challenges reporting human rights is the same as the challenges reporting anything else. It's perfectly true that it is the same in some ways. If you're writing, for example, about the municipal beat, you have to be accurate. You've got to know your stuff, and you've got to be able to do research, and you've got to have all those kind of skills. It's the same thing when you're writing about human rights. You have to have the basic skills to write a good story. You have to be a good journalist and know how to do research, as I've said. You have to be professional. You have to be thorough and patient. You must read widely on your subject and develop a good network of contacts. Already I've been talking to you about that being very important in relation to the lawyers that you need to get on your contact book. In short, you really have to be excellent at your job, or you must at least try to be excellent at your job. But it's also true that writing about human rights is absolutely different from any other kind of writing. And we'll spend the rest of the time looking at how it's different. There are challenges that you're going to face if you become a human rights writer that are quite different from any other beat. First of all, obviously, the content is different. You're not writing about the municipal beat, you're writing about human rights, so the content is different. But secondly, it's incredibly broad. The breadth of content. You can deal with health, family relationships, war and peace. It's just about every aspect of human life. A citizen's relationship with government through to family relationships, socio-economic questions, all of those sorts of things come into play. Another reason that I think is very different is, in fact, I don't know a single newspaper in South Africa which has the Human Rights Reporter. And I don't know how many there are overseas, so it's actually extremely rare to find somebody who's doing this kind of work. And there doesn't seem to be very much of a push towards getting that kind of beat in a newspaper. At the beginning of this year, for example, I went to The Hague to do a course on training journalists to do human rights work, to write about human rights, International Court of Justice, and so on. And since I've been back, I haven't found any newspaper in South Africa or any journalism department that's interested in having somebody who is a specialist in that field. So they're not particularly interested in learning about how to train journalists. Their view is that if we want a story about what's going on at the International Tribunal or something or other, we'll ask somebody who's there to do it. We won't ask somebody in South Africa to do it. And it's a great shame because I think they're trying to save money on flights, and they're trying to cater to who they think their audience is. They think that their audience is not particularly interested in that. So these are the kind of problems that we come across when we try to push the idea of human rights in South African newspapers. I was talking to you about the breadth of the issues that need to be covered. I haven't even talked yet about how the courts operate can become a human rights issue, as we'll see for an example I give at the end of our time together, and how society treats children and disabled people and minorities, and gay people and refugees and anyone who is seen as different. All of these issues make up the very wide spectrum of people and issues that would be covered, and that's in itself a very important difference between writing about human rights and writing about municipal reporting or what goes on the crime beat. In fact, you have to develop a kind of sensitivity to human rights that takes over and shapes who you are. You also get changed in how you look at life as you begin to work on human rights issues. You start to see things through a different prism. And that's incredibly useful and very exciting, but also sometimes quite dangerous. It can sometimes make you a very awkward and difficult friend because you've got these weird things that turn you on, things that you're interested in that other people aren't. So it can change your life, I suppose. you have to see the potential for human rights stories, for a human rights angle, in so many things that other people don't even notice. And that can be very challenging and exciting. I want to give you an example. In the late 1990s, shortly after we got our interim constitution, the final constitution hadn't yet been reached, and it was clear that there was a Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights was going to say that you couldn't discriminate against women. At that very time, I was reporting at the Supreme Court of Appeal, it was then called the Appellate Division, in Bloemfontein. And I went there quite often, and I had to report on cases. And I had a look to see what was coming up in the next term. And I found two cases that really were very interesting. They were both rape appeals, in which somebody who had been convicted of rape was now appealing. And in both cases, the person who was appealing because he said that the court, the trial court, had not properly observed what was called then the cautionary rule. I don't know whether anybody here knows anything about the cautionary rule. Just quickly tell me who does. They've heard of it. The cautionary rule said something like this. When you've got, in a rape case, the accused and only one witness, who is the plaintiff, the complainant, you have to be very careful because it's just one person's word against another. And it's a rule that you would use whenever there are just two people giving evidence, a complainant and somebody who is bringing somebody who's accused. But in a rape case, it was particularly nasty because the way in which the law was framed at that stage was, let me tell you about it, because you won't believe it, because I'm supposed most of you have grown up under the Bill of Rights. This cautionary rule, as applied by our courts, said that when women bring a claim of rape against somebody, you have to be particularly careful about her evidence. And there were all kinds of cases that said they tend to be hysterical, they can lie, there's full of sexual jealousy, women are not to be trusted, all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to read you something from one of the courts said. The cautionary rule in rape cases is based on the principle that women are naturally prone to lie and to fantasize, particularly in sexual matters, and that they are naturally vengeful and spiteful, and therefore likely to point a finger at an innocent man just out of spite. There's absolutely no evidence. The courts were coming, or rather academics and women were coming to say in the 1990s, there's absolutely no evidence that women are less truthful than men, or that they fantasize more. Such a suggestion is misogynistic. But in fact, this was what the courts were expected to do. When a trial court came across a case where it was just the woman, nobody else had been there giving evidence, they had to look at her evidence very, very cautiously and not accept it unless the particular criteria had been met. And so when I tell you that there were these cases coming up in the Supreme Court of Appeal where the accused was going to say that the trial court hadn't observed the cautionary rule, you can see that I got very interested because I knew that the Bill of Rights said you're not allowed to discriminate against women. So how was the court going to cope with the cautionary rule in which they were supposed to uphold this idea that women are innately liars when it comes to sexual matters? What were they going to do when the case came to court? So I decided to be prepared, and I phoned the chap who was going to be arguing the case on the behalf of the prosecution. And I said to him, I'm so excited. I hear that there's this case coming and you're going to be arguing it, and I'm sure you're going to raise the question of whether the cautionary rule is constitutional. How does it fit with our Bill of Rights? And he said to me that I got it wrong. This was a rape case. He said it's got nothing to do with the Constitution, it's got nothing to do with the Bill of Rights. So I felt very dampened and very unhappy that somebody in that kind of position who was able to help shape the law and shape the law for women and for the rights of women was sort of dumping his responsibility. So I went in onto court, and indeed he didn't raise the issue. It's a case of Chapman that you might read sometime. And to my total delight, the judges raised the case themselves, raised this question and said, is this what we should be doing in this day and age? They raised the question of the cautionary rule. And then the very next case that happened, they threw out the appeal. And then the very next case that was argued along these lines was called Jackson. And in that case, happily, the woman, the person who argued the case against the cautionary rule was a woman, and she really got to the heart of it. And the judgment that was given in the Jackson case then said, it's outdated, you can't have this anymore under our new system. But that's the kind of thing that I'm saying to you, that you've got to be on the lookout. You read the judgment and you read the rule, and you see here are two cases that are based on the cautionary rule, and you know what that is, because by the time your human rights reporters on your newspaper, you know very well things like that. You've got them under your belt, so you know the cautionary rule, bad. What are we going to do about it? And you try to, sort of prepare yourself for what's obviously going to happen in court. Okay. So that's the point that I'm trying to make about being aware of opportunities for human rights cases and seeing the whole world through this new prism. I'd like to look briefly at some other challenges peculiar to people who are writing about human rights. Obviously, in many cases, the writer is going to be unpopular, and depending on just how unpopular, there might actually be some physical or financial danger involved. For example, you might, if you're writing about your country's leader who is intolerant of criticism, you might find your car burnt or something. There's a kind of physical danger or economic danger if you lose your job. There are also often enormous difficulties in relation to the information you need to monitor and write about the situation. Sometimes you can get the information yourself. Other times you've got to rely on other people who are in the country, in the place where the human rights problems are taking place. Particularly if you're not allowed, if the press are not allowed in, then you're going to be dependent on the people who are actually there. And it's in this connection that I want to talk about the problem and the advantage of social media and human rights reporting. Obviously, it's really exciting for journalists if, during the war in Libya, for example, people who are on the ground send you information, or they post on Facebook, or they post on Twitter, because then you can get first-hand accounts. But it's also very dangerous because, first of all, it might not be true, and worse than that, it might not be true, and it might be somebody on the other side who is deliberately posting misinformation, expecting journalists to pick it up, so that the dictator or the government that's under threat, the anti-human rights government, can then say, you see, the press are printing lies. So you have to be very careful about the quality of information that you get when you depend on social media and citizen journalists. You know what citizen journalists are? Anyone not? Sure, okay. So there are a lot of internet sites where you can read information about how to approach social media, citizen journalism, in a way that will help you to screen out what's real and what's made up. And I asked for this particular site to be put up because I found it quite useful with some suggestions. You might like to make a note or ask the organisers of this meeting this evening to give you the website if it's of interest to you. But I've been discovering to my amazement that a large organisation like the BBC and the New York Times, for example, have got whole departments set aside just for fact-checking. And in the old days, fact-checking would just mean things like, if I wrote a story which said that a judge had died, before the thing was printed, it would go through the fact-checking department and they would make sure that the person had actually died. Now that kind of fact-checking has expanded enormously, and what they do is check that the social media on which they might be basing stories is actually valid and true. And I read some extraordinary, I think I'm going to stop here. Does anyone have any questions? I'm not used to just going blah, 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 blah. I'd really appreciate it if anyone's got any comment or questions as we go along. Anything? I'd love to know that you're actually listening. And that this is raising some issues for you. Okay, so what this fact-checking department does, for example, they'll get a photograph that says, this is a photograph of bodies taken after the government stormed, blah, 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 and their bodies all lie in their body bags, and in the background you can see whatever. And then the fact-checking department will actually sift through other photographs or call people who have actually been on the ground there and identify the building in the back, whether the images the image that they can see, does it show you that this is taking place in summer, for example, because they're green leaves or the trees are budding or whatever, whereas in fact the story is purported to have happened in winter. It's that kind of detail that you've got to get down to try to find out whether in fact the photographs that appear on Facebook or Twitter are real, whether journalists can actually rely on them in reporting on human rights abuses. That in itself is a subject of a semester of talks of class groups. So I'm just mentioning it in passing, and if it's something that interests you, you can take it up with, by reading blogs like this. I'm hoping that we can spend a bit more time now, perhaps till the end of our time together. Excuse me, talking about court cases, because that's what I do. I spend a lot of time going through court cases and finding very, very interesting and important human rights stories in those court cases. But before you can use them, you have to learn to be at ease with reading legal papers. You have to be very used to reading judgments. You have to be very used to accessing things like international bills of rights and so on, international and domestic instruments, human rights instruments. You have to be very familiar with them so that you can use them easily when it comes to court cases. And then you can quickly whisk through the story and find keywords and say, this is exciting. This is a case that I can make something of. This is worth spending time. And I'd like to tell you quickly about two stories that I've worked on in the last week. One you might have seen in today's Star. It was a story that I wrote, I thought it was column that appears in a group of papers every Thursday. And today's story is about a really interesting case in Uganda. Is anyone here from Uganda? It was the first human rights case brought to the Constitutional Court in Uganda based on that country's 1995 constitution, which dealt with health questions. And as it turns out, in Uganda, there is a really terrible problem of maternal death. There are 100 women dying every week in childbirth. That is 16 every day, because of bad treatment by doctors and nurses. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. Or because they don't have basic facilities at the hospitals, like they haven't got blood for blood transfusion. And as for the staff, I saw in this court case and in reporting around it, stories about 3 doctors who let somebody die because she didn't pay them extra. And about a midwives who are sleeping at the clinic and won't come out because they've had a tough day and they just let the woman bleed to death. It's really bad. And so what happened is there's an outfit in Uganda called the Center for Health, Human Rights and Development. And they got so fed up with what was going on that they decided to bring a petition in the Ugandan Constitutional Court, asking that court to declare that the government's health policies and the behavior of the health staff was unconstitutional. Now, does anybody here know about a case in South Africa called the Treatment Action Campaign? You do? What happened in that case?
They took the government to court for failing to provide antiretrovirals at a cheaper price to the general public.
Perfect. Thank you. Did everyone hear? Can I say it again? Okay. It's a case from a few years ago in which the Treatment Action Campaign, which is, as it suggests, a lobby group to make sure that everybody who is HIV positive or has AIDS and needs antiretroviral treatment can get it. We don't need it anymore, but thanks. Can get that treatment. And at the time, the government had a pilot project in terms of which there was a very small number of people that they were going to give that antiretrovirals to. And so the Treatment Action Campaign went to court, first to the High Court, then to the Appeal Court, then to the Constitutional Court, saying this is unconstitutional because if you don't roll it out to everybody who needs it, you're going to be putting everybody's right to life at risk, and people will die. And the Constitutional Court upheld that argument. Okay. So if this case had come to South Africa, the Uganda one I'm talking about, with all this terrible statistics and all that, I can just imagine what would have happened. But what happened in Uganda was that the people who argued the case for the government at the Constitutional Court said, no, you mustn't even begin to look at the merits of this case. Don't even look at the facts. This case, this petition needs to be dismissed out of hand because it is a political question. You are infringing on the government's right to draw up policy and practice. And if the court gets involved with that, it's an infringement of the separation of powers. And the Constitutional Court upheld that argument and threw out the case. Now, my story today begins with this sentence. If you want to see what a toothless court looks like, and what happens when such a court guards people's rights, just turn your eyes northwards to Uganda. And then I had a look at what happened in this case. Now, if you had just looked at that judgment, this is the point that I'm trying to make. You need to, I think that the academic jargon is interrogate the text. But as a journalist, I don't use that sort of language. I'm saying you read it and you wait for the flashbulbs to go off. Okay, it was called the most boring title you can imagine, something like Petition 14 of 2011, and you don't know what it's about. So you always want to read things like that, just to see, maybe it's going to turn out to be a very interesting thing. So when I was reading it, I saw the argument, and I saw the names of the people who brought it, and then I thought to myself, okay, there are a lot of questions that I would like to ask first of all about this before I rush into the print and say, Ugandan courts are terrible. Look what they did, they threw it out. So before I did that, I had to ask myself a number of questions. Can you think of anything that you would ask if you saw this judgment that said, this is a political question, we're not going to chuck it out. We can't interfere. Yeah.
I mean, since the court's immune from making rulings on politically charged decisions.
I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
Just since the court's immune, or wouldn't they stray from making decisions based on politically charged questions?
Since when can't we do it? Is that
yes,
what you asked?
I don't know. I'm thinking
Yes,
back to
yes.
Brown versus Board and the
Yes,
USA.
yes. Well, thinking about American cases brings me to the first one that I thought of, which is, did the lawyers screw up? Is this a case where a Brandeis sweep would have been appropriate? In other words, should they have come to court with a big fat dossier that said, okay, this is the number of people who died, this is how the government spends its money, brings a whole lot of socio-economic argument, as well as the legal argument. Is this a case where that didn't happen? And are the lawyers responsible for not dealing with that question properly? So that's one question you could ask yourself where a case fails like this. Can you think of anything else that you might ask? How about, what does the Constitution say? What does the Constitution say about whether you can bring cases, whether the court is empowered to rule on? It might be that they've got a very bad constitution that says that the courts can't interfere. In South Africa, it's not like that. We've got a very specific clause that permits the courts to be able to intervene. And in fact, as it turns out, there is, to answer my question, there is a section in that Constitution that says, anyone who alleges that an act or omission by any person or authority is inconsistent with or in contravention of the Constitution may petition the Constitutional Court for a declaration to that effect and for redress when appropriate. So there seems to be something, but you have to check. I'm just going through all the hoops that a person would have to check before you can rush into print. So I want to check the Constitution and see what it says. I want to find out whether the lawyers made a mistake and they didn't bring a properly argued case. Another thing that I think that I should have checked, and that you should if you were working on the story, is what is the structure in Uganda of the courts? Where in the hierarchy does the Constitutional Court come? Who knows where in South African courts the Constitutional Court comes? Right on the top. Certainly it's right on the top when it comes to constitutional issues. In other words, if we'd gone to the Constitutional Court and it had thrown it out, what would then have happened? that was the end. Okay, is this the case? I want to know. In Uganda. So you go and have a look at what the court structure is like, and lo and behold, it's not the top court. The Constitutional Court is actually the appeal court, and it comes before the top court. It's the appeal court wearing a hat that says Constitutional Court when it's a constitutional matter that they're busy considering. So what does that mean if you discover that the Constitutional Court is not at the top and the Constitutional Court throws out something? What does that mean? What are the implications? If you're an answer, will you answer it aloud? Or is hang on, let's see if anybody else has got an idea. If it's not the apex court, the Constitutional Court in Uganda, what can happen next? You look as if you're about to give me an answer.
I would feel like it couldn't be taken any further because
It could not.
yes, because even if you could take it to a court that's above the Constitutional Court, what could be more important than the Constitution? Maybe because I'm South African, but
Yeah.
I feel like then the structure must be corrupt. Therefore, it wouldn't even be considered.
But that's in fact what happened, is that they are appealing and they have taken it to the next highest court, which is the apex. And the people said, who brought the case, if we lose there, that's not the end for us either. No, this is for a bit of lateral thinking. Imagine you've now gone up through the second highest and the highest court in Uganda, and you lose, supposing they lose, because we haven't got the answer yet. So they're going to, supposing they lose in the highest court, and then the people who are bringing the case say, that's still not the end of the road for us because we're going to do what? We're going to take it where? That's the clue. Take it where? I think you're going to answer the question. The woman behind you. Yes, you.
Me?
No, behind you.
Okay.
Yes. Where are they going if they can't get the right answer in Uganda?
Where are they going?
Where will they take the matter?
I think, the ICJ. I mean, the ICC, like the...
It's not a criminal matter at this stage. Let's see if anyone else has got an idea. Yeah. Can't hear you.
You could try a regional court or...
Yes, what regional court? Where will they go? The African Court of Human and People's Rights. That's where they say they're going if they lose. Okay, so now it's before the highest court and we wait for what happened. But what happened in the meantime is that the people who brought the case were trying to sort of console themselves. So they said, never mind, we've lost at the Constitutional Court, but at least the subject has been raised. It's now on the agenda. Wrong. What happened 3 weeks later is that a woman went to a health establishment, the health facility, I don't know what exactly to call it, to go and have a baby, and the midwife was there, and she was sleeping in the room that she'd been given inside the health facility, and she refused to come out. She said she'd had a heavy day. The woman bled to death. So it's making people extremely angry. What happened next after she bled to death is the people in the surrounding villages, surrounding community, stormed the health facility, and they wanted to lynch the nurse. The riot police were brought in. They rescued her, but then they charged her subsequently for negligence because she should have attended to the woman. So in a way, they're right. It has raised the issue. The police now think they've got to do something about it, but in another way, it's not good enough, is it? Just raising the issue because the authorities haven't told the nurses and the doctors and the midwives, get out there and do your duty. They're still able just to sort of thumb their noses at the women who come and desperately need their help. So I think that just looking superficially at this, you get some idea of the kind of questions that you need to ask. And the fact that this is the very first case of this kind that's been brought in Uganda means that you should start keeping an eye on what happens in that court. And I began to do that. I started to do some research about what other cases have been brought. And it turns out that that court, the Constitutional Court in Uganda, is quite good at making environmentally sound decisions. So it's really weird to me why they get good decisions on environment, but not on health. And that's something that I'd like to look at again. So, I don't know, should I stop now? I want to tell you the case that I looked at last night and wrote a story about last night. It was amazing. I didn't realize that you could get into regional human rights issues through a court case like I did last night, and I'm really looking forward to telling you about it. So, it's about the Swazi courts. So now we finished Uganda, and I thought, well, it's quite close, I better have a look at what's going on there. Does anybody here know anything about the situation as far as human rights is concerned in Swaziland? Yes, again, can you help? Anybody help me? What's going on in Swaziland? Well, I must confess that I was almost as bad as that before I started my work last night. I had the sense that King Mswati is a tyrant, actually. He is an absolute monarch, and he has outlawed political parties. They've been banned since 1970 something or other, 73, since the mid-70s. And he is one of the richest rulers in the world. Can you believe it? From Swaziland. And his country is one of the poorest, and it has the highest HIV/AIDS figures on the planet. And it is desperately poor, and the people are desperate for human rights to try and lift themselves, and they are having a really bad time. So I thought, okay, what is actually happening in the courts there? And I started to read some judgments last night from 2012. And the first two were just sort of crime cases about rape and how they deal with them. They haven't got the portioning rule anymore either, so that was a bit of a good thing. And then I suddenly came across a divorce case, which looked extremely boring, but I decided I would push through and see what it was about. And from that divorce case, I found out the most amazing things about what's going on in Swaziland. Because this is what happened. The husband and the wife were fighting about what was going to happen in the divorce. And finally, last year, the matter came to the highest court. And as it turned out, the father, I'll explain why in a minute, was not represented in court. So the court made a ruling, and for all intents and purposes, ended the case with that hearing last year. And that was supposed to be the end of the matter. But this year, the father came back to court and said, I want to appeal against the decision that you made last year. Now, I don't know whether you know, but once the highest court has ruled, that's it. The matter is closed. You can't go back on it. So he had to find a really good reason to explain why he needed the matter to be revisited and why he was back in court. And what turned out to be the case was that when his case was answered, he wasn't represented because that was the very day on which a big protest started in Swazi courts. The lawyers in Swaziland were so angry about what was going on in the courts that they decided to boycott the courts. And they refused to appear in any court in Swaziland for months and months and months last year. I didn't know about that. I bet you didn't either. And so, on this day, the guy appeared in court, but his lawyer wasn't there. So he wasn't able to put his point of view. So the court found for the woman. Now the man comes back and he says, start from the beginning again, I want to have my day in court. And now I'm going to leave it there while I tell you what the lawyers were complaining about. And then I'll come back and explain what happened in his case. And all of this I found out because I was reading this judgment. And so what I'm saying to you is that they are incredibly useful tools for finding out information about human rights abuses. This is what has happened in Swaziland. The king has decided that the courts were getting out of control because some of the judges were making judgments in which they were favoring human rights. So the king called a new Chief Justice to come and head the judiciary in Swaziland. And he is a chap from Lesotho, where he heads the judiciary in Lesotho. And he's also on the appeal court in Botswana. And he's Michael Ramodibede. He is the Chief Justice in Lesotho. He was brought in last year because the king wanted him to try and keep everybody, this is what it seems, to keep everybody under control. And he's been very willing to do that. And the Human Rights Watch has been writing a lot about him, saying that they're very worried about the rule of law in that country. And if you go to read their 2011 report that came out this year, you'll see exactly the sort of thing that he's been doing. So, one of the things that he did was to suspend and later dismiss a Swazi judge called Thomas Masuku, who had given several human rights judgments, as I indicated. And in one of his judgments, he had referred in the same breath to the king and to speaking with a forked tongue. And the king was highly insulted, and the Chief Justice decided that this was not to be allowed, and so he's now suspended and thrown out to that judge. And the point is that the judge never said the king spoke with a forked tongue. What he said was he was going to reject the evidence given by one party in the case, because if he were to accept it, it would mean that he would have to accept that the king spoke with a forked tongue. And clearly, that was not so. So it wasn't that he said that the king spoke with a forked tongue, he was deliberately saying he didn't. But the very fact of putting those two phrases into one sentence was too much for the king's dignity and honor. So the judge has to go. Another thing that he did, the Chief Justice, was there was 5 women in his department, the Chief Justice's department, brought a sexual harassment case against the Chief Justice to the Judicial Service Commission. And as you can imagine, all the newspapers in Swaziland were extremely excited, and they were carrying this and carrying this. And then the JSC told the newspapers that they were not allowed to carry another word of what was going on in this complaint. So the newspapers have been totally shut up. Human Rights Watch also says that the Chief Justice has taken control over the daily allocation of cases for hearings, including urgent matters, and that this was seen by lawyers as creating an unacceptable bias in the administration of justice. It means that the Chief Justice can just make sure that his carefully picked people get to hear the cases that need human rights or anti-human rights attention. And that, you may not know, is exactly what happened in South Africa during the times of apartheid, when there was a small group of judges at the appeal court, which was then our highest court, and the Chief Justice selected from only amongst those judges, the judges who would hear the cases that could potentially further the cause of apartheid. So we've been there, done that, we know it when we see it, and that's what's going on at the moment in Swaziland. And also, during June 2011, the Chief Justice published a directive, I'm now reading from the Human Rights Watch, saying that the king was protected from any civil law claim. From now on, nobody is allowed to bring any action against the king. Now that might sound to you as if it's sort of neither here nor there who wants to sue the king, but a lot of people might want to sue the king. For example, the Mail and Guardian had a story about a department of the king's administration which moved into a B&B, a guest house, and just stayed there for years and years and years without paying. Now they can't go to court to say, pay us the money that you owe us. They are bankrupt because they're not allowed to go to court. So the point that the Human Rights Watch makes is that this is a clear violation of a citizen's right to be protected by the law and to be heard by an independent judiciary. So I could go on giving you story after story like this of what the Chief Justice is involved in. And that was the reason why these lawyers have been having this boycott against the and refusing to appear in court and refusing to appear before the Chief Justice. Now, to go back to our story, wrapping up now, the story about the case that I read last night, the divorce case. When the husband said, I want to go back to court because my lawyer wasn't in court, the Chief Justice who was hearing the case and 2 other judges said, tough luck, you should have been in court. They said, the lawyer will hardly be in a position to discharge his or her overriding duty to the court while engaging in a boycott at the behest of the Law Society, or in response to promptings from any other source, or by absenting himself or herself for any other reason while bearing the onerous and sacred burdens of the lawyer of record. In other words, they say you've got this high duty as lawyers to appear in court for your client, and you shouldn't have gone on this protest. And my comment to that is the following. Onerous and sacred these burdens might well be, but the Chief Justice and the other judges sitting with him on this matter have overlooked a crucial fact. In the eyes of many right-thinking people, there's an even higher responsibility, namely the duty of lawyers to serve justice, human rights, and the rule of law. And that's the kind of thing that you can write and say if you really go in and find out about, if you really go into detail about what's going on in court cases. You can sometimes hit gold like that and find a really interesting case that explains to you exactly what's going on in terms of human rights violations in South Africa or elsewhere. So I'll be very happy to take some questions. Right. Who's interested in asking what?
Carmel's told me that she's not a lawyer. Again, that's not totally fact. Well, it's fact, yes, but she's finished an LLM. So she's quite serious about wanting to research the law. She's also told you that she's essentially a reporter who left the classroom during
A
long time ago. Yet her demeanor speaks about her complete relaxed approach to you as an audience, and therefore I don't think you've left the classroom completely. Maybe you should return. But more than that, we have this social activist, a former teacher, who's now completed this LLM degree, who dissects legal cases with a view to trying to look for justice in them. Right? That might be a summary of her presentation so far. And she's taken us through all the challenges of being a reporter, including the difficulty of always knowing your facts, and then always making sure that the law is not too far away from the facts, whether it's a Brandeis brief or any other kind of case that we bring to a court of law. I think she's done a fantastic job of showing us what some of you who are sitting on the outside of this podium is why you study human rights, because there might be a journalist amongst you who's probably going to want to report the social justice issues, because I think a good human rights reporter, when you report on social justice issues, you start creating the consciousness about human rights. That's clearly creating a culture of human rights. You spoke about the challenges, you spoke about the difficulties, you spoke about cases in Uganda and Swaziland. So clearly your vision and view is not just the local or the parochial. And you write some pretty good stories about the platteland these days also. So I think if there's any example of, let's say, where the international human rights can be brought to the local dimension, or the local dimension can be projected to the international or even the regional, as you showed, I think a good reporter on human rights can do that. That's a sort of summary of my views of what she's trying to tell us for a while, but I'm sure many of you have questions for her, because you might have been stunned in between as she stopped her presentation to say, are there any questions? That's because she's not a teacher. Do you have any questions? Observations?
Is there anyone here who's a journalist and wants to be a journalist? Is there anyone who wants to be a lawyer? Okay. Even lawyers have to train themselves to ask the right questions, and that is what I was trying to show. Yeah.
Just about the reaction to some of your articles that you write. Do you ever experience censorship with the papers that you are attempting to publish in?
I would have experienced censorship of some kind in the days before the Constitution. I can remember during states of emergency, for example, when I was writing for newspapers, that advised us, I'll just say a word about how we code, that advised us not to censor ourselves, not to try to write within the framework of the regulations and the laws that stop the press. They said, write the story properly, and we'll have a dedicated person to make sure that that it doesn't infringe any legislation. That was a good idea, because if you try to do it yourself, you might well cut out more than you need. And your attitude then becomes quite lazy, because then you say to yourself, I don't need to find that out because I can't write it anyway. So they were always pushing us to get to the bottom of the story and do it properly. Nowadays, I don't have that kind of concern. Yeah. I just want, I'm concerned myself sometimes about stories that I'm writing. For example, there's a very controversial judge president in the Western Cape, John Thorpe, who is at the moment under consideration by the Judicial Service Commission because the Constitutional Court judges complained against him. They laid a complaint against him with the Judicial Service Commission. And sometimes I write very, very critical stuff about him. And then I contact the newspaper group that I write for and I say to them, please have somebody check this. But apart from that, I mean, that's a kind of, I'm trying to protect them from defamation or whatever. So I take that step myself, but otherwise I don't experience it. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit holistically about your habitual practices of research. Like you were talking about just last night, working through this case, so just like more of your own personal just tendencies when compiling a story, where you go to look for information, how you compile information, just your process essentially.
When I was working on the cautionary rule case that I was talking about at the beginning, Dr. Google wasn't then a household name, or you didn't visit every household at that stage. So it meant having to do work in actual libraries, checking what things were, and phoning around contacts, and saying to people that I think are the top of their profession, either at the bar or teaching at a university, can you point me exactly where I need to go to look for this? Sometimes I've got the reference books myself, so I do have a little library. And now I've also got copies of the international instruments that I would be wanting to cross-check with from courses that I did on international human rights. And so I would have that reference material. That's okay. But I don't know what the Swazi or what the Ugandan constitution is. So I would typically look for a copy of that. And there are some sites on the web where you can find African, sub-Saharan countries in Africa post where you can find judgments. So that's where I typically would start. I try to keep up every week with what's been going on in South African courts, what judgments have been published. I try to read them all. And then some weeks when it's a slow week and the stories are quite boring, or when the courts are in recess, then I go and have a look at Namibia or whatever, and typically people will send me stories too. Namibian lawyers, for example, quite often send me stories. And then I would find out that there's the most amazing series of stories from Namibia where judgments, including by the Chief Justice, are more than 10 years delayed. The judge hasn't handed down judgment 10 years later. 10 years later. The Chief Justice hasn't. Can you imagine what sort of an example that sets to his colleagues? So when I first got a judgment in which that was clear, I contacted the Law Society in Namibia, and I asked them whether they'd ever made a statement about this. Had anyone ever made official comments about this, and could I have comments of those kind of comments? So I tried to be not just using Google, not just using the internet, also getting on the phone to people I know, or using actual books, as I said, or I don't know whether I answered your question, but wide. Think widely.
Do the articles you write on
do the articles you write about other countries such as Namibia, Swaziland, and Uganda actually get published in those countries, and the government see how its external?
I thought you were going to ask me, do they get published here? And I'll answer your question in a minute. I'm interested that they get published here. I really like that, because what I'm trying to explain to people is that we are part of a region, and this, did you deal with the closure of the SADC tribunal? There was a tribunal that was set up for the Southern African Development Region that was based in Namibia, and all kinds of human rights cases came there. And for a few years it was doing fabulous work. And then last year, or perhaps it was the year before, Zimbabwe managed to close it down, which is a tragedy, and we hope that something else will come in its place. But I think that human rights in a region are kind of enmeshed like this. You know, if human rights in one country are failing, it's going to have a knock-on effect into other countries. And I think that's what I'm trying to, why I'm interested in talking about other countries' experience. So, and there's another reason actually also. I want people in South Africa who read my stories and who live here, whether they're South Africans or not, to feel very, very passionately about the Constitution and about the Bill of Rights. I really want them to feel that this thing means a lot to me personally. My future, my freedom, the freedom and the future and the safety and the security and the happiness of my family and my whole community is partly hanging on this Constitution and this Bill of Rights. And the reason that I want them to feel so passionately about it, can anybody give a reason? Why would it be good for that to happen? I'm scared that sometime we're going to start seeing an attempt by the government to change the Constitution, to change the Bill of Rights, into a way that will allow the kind of violations of human rights that we see in our neighboring countries. I'm scared of that. And so what I'm hoping is that if I make people, or if people become, if I'm not successful personally, I really want people to feel, as I say, passionate, so that if that happens, they will say, stop. We believe in this Constitution. We believe in the human rights that it promises us, and we're going to stand up and defend it. You can go no further. That's what I want. And I hope that if we see violations in other countries, and I bring them to the attention of people, that will be part of this process of creating that atmosphere. Now, your question was, do they ever get carried in those countries? Well, I had a very funny experience the other day. One of the Namibian stories that I wrote appeared in a Namibian paper. They'd simply lifted it, and they hadn't asked. And I didn't mind really, but I would have liked if they put at the bottom my blog address or something. I mean, I just wanted them, I want people to go to know about my blog, which is called A Free State of Mind. I wanted them to put that at the bottom so that people would go and read other stories. But I felt quite flattered in a way, because Namibia actually carried that story. I mean, the Namibian, without asking, that wasn't so great, but they did carry it. And I think that they hoped that by carrying that story, it would sort of shame the Chief Justice into behaving better. And my story had also mentioned this thing about the Law Society and other people having spoken out. So I was just hoping that that would have its effect. But you know, it takes a long time for this to happen. And this afternoon I got 2 emails from Uganda, from people who'd seen the story that appeared this morning, to say, you know, it helps them that there's coverage elsewhere as well. But what I must say is that you can't just say, oh, the Ugandan court has thrown this out. This is terrible, because maybe it was right to throw it out. Maybe it was the wrong case, the wrong set of facts. Maybe the lawyers presented it badly. You can't always say that it was the fault of the courts. That's why I'm saying don't go for a knee-jerk reaction. Do the homework to make sure that you get it right. That's what. Yeah.
I think human rights is right if we have the same as in the township for our community, because people are fighting against their rights and they can't get that what we call, they can't get service in other places. There is justice. They run for protection each and every time they don't get that service. So I think it's right, it's being pushed more often.
Great, thank you. I must say, I live in in a Catalan very, very small. We don't have tarred roads, we don't have a chemist, we haven't even got a traffic light. It's a London stop street. And the people there, including, get very bad service. And we would like to have protests, and I would like to say to people, here is the Constitution, this is what we're entitled to. And it really would be fantastic if there could be a sort of national grouping of people who appeal to the Constitution for their socio-economic rights and delivery of services. Sorry, please.
I just wanted to know, as a journalist, obviously in your act you have to have a certain approach, but do you feel that sometimes you have to take a certain perspective without sometimes giving like two sides to the story? Because, for instance, you could say with that Ugandan case, well, okay, there's people bleeding to death, but what if they're understaffed and they don't have enough people? What about that perspective? So do you have to sometimes sort of lean towards one side of the story when reporting?
It's very useful to go with a court case because inevitably, if you do enough research, you can get the papers from both sides and then you can see what the argument was on the side about lack of... let's take the TAC case that you mentioned earlier, or that we discussed earlier. There were papers, 2 sets of papers. I've been discussing what the human rights perspective was. But there was the government's point of view about lack of staff. It was the time of Mbeki's administration, and we were saying we need to check whether this is poisonous. People might die from taking ARBs. Remember that time? So all of that argument was there, and and the court has dismissed that, it's saying it's a load of rubbish. So then why must I spend time on that if the court, you can mention it, but you don't need to go into great detail about it if the court has dismissed it. I don't think, once the court has ruled, but before you need to give both sides. But once the court has ruled and it's weighed up, you don't give the losing side as much time as the side that wins, necessarily. You could say the court dismissed the argument that, and then you had a few sentences or a few paragraphs in that, but you're focusing on what they did find, rather than what they didn't find, at least in this case. But yes, you do need to bear that in mind, and to have a look at what stage the legal proceedings has reached. Yeah. I mean, would you agree with that?
Sort of, kinda. I feel sometimes that when things are reported in the media, it's obviously to portray a certain image, but then when you delve deeper, you find that, okay, there are other factors that need to be considered that might not have been mentioned in a particular article.
Yes.
That could bring the whole thing into a broader picture than that specific thing that was picked out. And I feel like there should also be more positive reporting and negative reporting in the media. That's just my personal opinion. So yeah, that's why I was asking you. I mean, are you told to bring out a certain...
I'm never told to do anything. The stories that I need, but what goes on in the newsroom, I've never experienced in quite a long period of experience as a journalist. I've never heard anybody say you cannot take that line. I've often heard people say that is not balanced. Go and phone so-and-so to find out, the balance to the story. Go and phone so-and-so. Have you checked with so-and-so? That happens a lot. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I'm dealing with 2 sets of papers, usually. In the Ugandan case, I was able to follow up by looking at comments from both sides afterwards. They both, and also, no, not in Swaziland. That wasn't appropriate because that's not what the case was about. It was about a divorce. But in the Ugandan case, yes, obviously, it's a question of there's only so much money, should we be spending it on health or should we be spending it on something else? That's the bottom of the line of the government, yeah.
Can I just do a follow-up on that? Our government at the moment is feeling under a great deal of pressure because the press is going into spaces that they would much rather be ignored. And this is investigative journalism at its best, when it functions well. As a result, government might well make that argument that we need positive stories. Just as our president said recently, there is service delivery in the country, but they may not be sufficient. So there's a way of actually qualifying the larger criticism. I think the best way to answer that might be taking the state view, you don't get a balanced report. Now, clearly in an article when you've got given so many columns and so many words to have to express an opinion, you can't give every possible version or side to that. You have to take a stance, and the stance is on the side of social justice. But government says that maybe newspapers are too negative, and they're reporting only on the negative social issues, but not the positive. And we can see government, press departments and communications departments working very hard to give a positive spin to a number of social issues.
One of the reasons why I like people to go to my blog is that when I write a story about a judgment, I post the judgment or judgments underneath. So people can go and look for themselves, and if they disagree with my interpretation, they can say so. So that's one way of dealing with it. And you must think, I mean, I don't know how long your essays are, but you know at the end of an essay you very often think, I have so much more to say. And now you've got 500 words there. And at the end of that time, you haven't really got into it enough. And so at a certain stage, some stories that you require, sometimes the paper will say to a journalist who's got experience in the subject, explain this to us. Explain to the reader what's going on here. And then you're not required to give sort of 250 words for that side, 250 words for that side. You're supposed to sort of do broad brushstrokes, and by the end of it, people must be more understanding the sort of the depth of the political argument that's at stake. It's really very difficult if you think about the space in print, but that's not the case in the electronic media, and that's why I'm really delighted to be able to put up the judgment for people to see.
So can you please have your blog again one more time?
Yeah, it's HTTP blah 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 blah. But if you go to the Google thing, to the up at the top, and you just write Carmel Rickard one word, .posterous.com, or you Google a free state of mind, because that's where I live. Fine. Yes. Yay! I knew you were going to say something. I just didn't know the timing of it.
Okay. This is quite interesting. I think your line of work is pretty interesting. I'd like to know, have you done any work on the Protection of Information Bill and what implications it would have on our Constitution? And do you know, like, where we're standing with that currently?
The short answer is yes and no. Last year I taught law to journalists at Rhodes for 6 months, and during that time I was up to date with what was happening. Since then, I'm back in my little clutterbuck door, and I don't really know what's going on in quite the same way as I used to. But so let me pass. I'm sorry. I might make mistakes. Sorry. You could be. Does
She's a radio
anybody?
journalist.
You are.
She has a radio.
You have a radio station.
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah. What's it called?
It's the campus one.
Oh,
Voice
really?
of It. Yes.
Yeah. I think that you need to be concerned about this. I think you do need to speak to people who know more about it than I do at this stage. And if you can't think of anybody, let me know. And I'll find some expert to tell you what's about him. And I presume you do know.
I don't know, like, last I heard they were still negotiating whether they should go ahead with
Yeah.
the media tribunal.
Yeah. I think it would be very good for you, either through the department or personally, to get hold of a service called Legal Briefs. And on Legal Briefs, they've also got one called Legal Briefs Environment and Legal Briefs Forensics and various other things. But Legal Briefs is watching that very closely. I mean, so is the freedom of expression and other things. I'm sure you know those. If you don't, let me give you some links later. I mean, I know where to find out. If I had to write a story tomorrow, I could do it. But I don't carry it around in my head.
Any other? Well, then it just remains for me to thank you very much, Carl, for taking the charge to come to